You might be looking at your flex spots as well as your additional bench spots on your week 1 2024 fantasy football rosters and be thinking, how can I absolutely dominate my week 1 opponent? Well, here are 6 running backs that absolutely need to be in your starting lineups because they present week 1 winning upside. Let's break down these players and why you absolutely need to start them heading into week 1. All right, first up is going to be Alvin Kamara at home against the Carolina Panthers, going up against what was one of the absolute worst run defenses in the NFL last year. Very, very kind to opposing running backs in fantasy football last year, and I don't think that this run defense for the Panthers has necessarily improved throughout the offseason. Plus, like I said, on the road here, this is just a tough matchup overall for Carolina, both offensively and defensively. The Saints in a really good spot in week 1 to come out with a dominant performance, even if they aren't overall the best offense. Alvin Kamara is still a player last year who averaged double-digit fantasy points per game. And I think when you really break down what Alvin Kamara did last year, you kind of remember those first couple games when he came back from suspension where his target share was really high. And then some people kind of think that his season died down fantasy-wise after those first couple games, but it absolutely didn't. He was disappointing throughout the fantasy playoffs, but still, he only gave you single-digit fantasy performances twice last year. Absolutely going to get the bulk of the carries for the Saints this week. He's easily the workhorse running back here, and even if he's not the most efficient, that PPR upside is just massive against this awful Panthers defense. You know he's going to get all those checkdowns from Derek Carr, and he has high touchdown rushing upside here in week 1. So Kamara, a player who maybe you got a little bit later in your drafts, maybe is hanging around on the bench in some formats. Don't let Kamara be a sit this week. He's an absolute must start moving into week 1. Next up, we've got James Cook going up against the Arizona Cardinals, who had the worst run defense in the entire NFL last season. They gave up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And I don't think we've seen much throughout the offseason that supports the fact that they theoretically improved that run defense in the offseason. This is a home game for the Bills. This is a smash spot for Bills offensive players, but I think primarily in this first game with this new Bills offense where we no longer have Stephon Diggs, James Cook is going to get a massive amount of volume, and he has that nice PPR upside. You see 44 receptions last year, 445 receiving yards, so we know that he's very consistent when he does get those receptions, but he has great touchdown upside this week as well. Like I said, this is going to be a different offense this year. You got that Frankenstein room of wide receivers. We'll see how that plays out, but overall, that's going to lead to James Cook getting way more touches in this respective offense. So, home game here, great opponent. I think you were probably starting James Cook anyways, but if for some reason, you got him a little bit later in your draft and he's sitting on the bench, he is not a player you can afford to sit this week. James Cook comes in such a smash spot, has so much upside this week. You absolutely need to start him moving into week 1. All right, next up is Kenneth Walker at home against the Denver Broncos, who, once again, here's the theme, were one of the worst run defenses in the entire NFL last year. Maybe they improved throughout the offseason, but let's have them prove it to us first because this is another offense and a smash spot at home in week 1. And once again, we're looking at a pure workhorse running back in Kenneth Walker, who's had nothing but great coach speak throughout the offseason. We know that he's going to be heavily involved with a new offensive coordinator here, and we know that they've also talked a lot throughout the offseason about Kenneth Walker being much more involved in the passing game. So there's really no reason why you should be sitting Walker. And I mean, we get a lot of fantasy questions here on the channel. We see a lot of different rosters, and I have seen rosters with guys like James Cook, Alvin Kamara, and Kenneth Walker who are coming in as RB3s or players who just fell in drafts, who are drafted in later rounds, and they might be sitting on your bench. Kenneth Walker, once again, another player you cannot afford to sit this week. The matchup is way too good. It should be a dominant home performance for the Seattle Seahawks. And even if it's not, Kenneth Walker, way too much upside. He should absolutely smash in week 1 fantasy football. All right, it's not a must-start style of video if I don't talk about my boy Rachaad White, who has a beautiful home matchup against the Washington Commanders defense, one of the worst overall defenses in the league last year when we look at the fantasy points they allowed to both running backs and wide receivers. obviously a bottom 10 unit against the run last year, and this is just a smash spot for Rachaad White, the RB4 in full PPR. Let me remind you, Rachaad White, a top 5 running back in fantasy football last year. Even if he wasn't the most efficient, we know what he can do with that PPR upside. 64 receptions, 549 receiving yards, 9 total touchdowns, 15.8 fantasy points per game last year for Rachaad White. Absolutely love the Buccaneers offense moving into week 1 as a whole. There's no reason to be sitting Rachaad White. He's another one of these players who you may have ended up as an RB3. Maybe you got him a little bit later if you didn't go hero or zero running back in your draft. But regardless, if Rachaad White's your RB2, even if you have a good RB1 in that RB1 slot, you need to keep Rachaad White in your starting lineups. Way too much upside. He has double touchdown rushing upside in this game. PPR upside. He's going to have a monster week 1 performance. You cannot bench Rachaad White moving into week 1. I like Rachaad White so much this week that I would head straight over to underdogfantasy.com and take the over on his rushing yards, currently sitting at 58.5 rushing yards. You could pair that line with just about any player in this video, and I would feel good. But also, if you are new to Underdog Fantasy, you can use promo code THECATCH. That link is down below, and that's going to get you a week 1 special pick'em that you can also pair with that Rachaad White line. That's going to be Travis Kelce over half of a total yard. And while you are doing that, you're also going to receive a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 on Underdog Fantasy. That's up to $1,000 in bonus cash that you can use on Underdog Fantasy. Promo code THECATCH to claim that special week 1 pick'em and to get that 50% deposit match. Next on the list, we've got the Gus Bus himself going up against the Las Vegas Raiders at home. And I do think that the Raiders defense might kind of surprise us in this game. I'm a little bit worried about the Chargers offense as a whole, but I'm more worried about like how mobile is Justin Herbert going to be in this game. How does that wide receiver room shape out in this first game under new offense with Jim Harbaugh? But what I'm not so worried about is the fact that, yes, this is a Jim Harbaugh offense, which means that they are going to run the football. And I do think as the season goes on, we may see more involvement from J.K. Dobbins or Kamani Vidal. But at the end of the day, Gus Edwards, week 1 is your guy to start. Definitely a player who you probably got later in your drafts. If you went zero or hero running back, this might be a guy that you have to consider at RB2 this week. And I absolutely think you can consider Gus Edwards a must start this week. The total upside, maybe not crazy because, we know he's not going to get a crazy amount of PPR upside as he only had 12 receptions last year. But his rushing upside on the ground in this week 1 performance should be absolutely stout. 13 rushing touchdowns last year with the Ravens. Maybe he doesn't hit that this year in a less efficient offense. But here in week 1 against a Raiders unit that really struggled against the run last year, he is going to get all of that goal line work. And don't get me wrong, Christian Wilkins now part of that defensive line for the Raiders. Might change things a little bit with Max Crosby on the other end. But at the end of the day, all the goal line work, I think almost all of the volume in week 1 is going to Gus Edwards. The rest of that Raiders defense outside of those two guys, I can hardly name anyone. So I love Gus Bus this week. If you're in a position where you might have to line them up as your RB2, he definitely has plenty of upside moving into week 1. All right, last but not least, let's pick a player with a tougher matchup. That's DeAndre Swift at home against the Tennessee Titans, who were a top 12 unit against running backs last year. But that secondary and those linebackers not necessarily great at covering receiving running backs last year. DeAndre Swift has been a running back who I've liked throughout the offseason at his ADP, where you could get him in drafts. And now, if you do have DeAndre Swift, he's either coming in on a lighter RB build as your RB2, or he's just a pure bench running back. But I really like him moving into week 1. I like the offensive position that the Bears are going to be in week 1 against the Titans at home. I think that stadium's going to be going crazy. You got Caleb Williams in his first start. Love the wide receivers for the Bears this week, but I also really like DeAndre Swift. I've said it all offseason long. I think he is the most talented running back on the Bears roster. So even if we start to see some volume go to Herbert or Roschon Johnson, I'm not ultimately worried about it because in fantasy and full PPR formats, the running back who's going to get the volume is going to be DeAndre Swift. I think that Caleb Williams is going to have to check down to him. They're going to find ways to utilize DeAndre Swift. We saw that in the preseason. DeAndre Swift, even though the tush push started to ruin his fantasy season last year, was on a really consistent start at the beginning of the fantasy season, and he still gave you 12.5 fantasy points per game last year. So I like him in this offense. I really believe they're going to find ways to utilize him. And I think early in the season here in week 1, he's going to get most of the goal line work and have that touchdown upside. We know week in, week out, he brings that PPR upside to the table. So I like this matchup a lot. Even though it's a little bit more stout, I like this matchup for the Bears offense as a whole. And I think DeAndre Swift ready to surprise people in week 1 and bring a little bit of upside to the table. That'll do it for today's video. Do not forget that we have start, sits, out for every running back, every wide receiver, every quarterback and tight end, every single matchup. I'll link those down below, and you guys can find them on the channel as well. If you guys need anything, any fantasy football questions, any format, start, sits, trades, waivers, team reviews, whatever it may be, drop them down below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. And if you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out. But most importantly, get ready to dominate your week 1 opponent by starting the players that were in today's video. With that, I will say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.